Greetings, OUXers. Sophia here. So, this week and through the end of the year, due to it being the holidays and all that entails, we will be revisiting our most popular, most OUXy episodes from the UX Hustle podcast. This is a podcast I started back in 2018 and have since handed off to the new host, Amanda Worthington, fellow OUXer and a dear friend of mine. So, we're going to start back with new episodes in 2021. The episode that we're going to be doing today is all about OUX in business and OUX in games, and it's an interview with Carolyn Sober-James. So Carolyn has journeyed from database architect to UX designer to fellow object-oriented UX evangelist. She was actually part of the very first cohort at the beginning of the year, the very first cohort of the OUX certification program, and she's continued to stay involved and be a mentor in the OUX community. She is the UX director at Acumium in Madison, Wisconsin, where she strives to lead her team with radical candor. And we talk about this book, Radical Candor, that I bought right after we discussed this months ago. And I am finally reading the book. I'm about 3/4 of the way through, and it's really good. So this conversation was originally recorded back in February of 2020, which feels like a world away from where we are now in life, but I promise it's as relevant as ever when it comes to object-oriented UX. So if you didn't listen to it back in February, make sure to keep listening, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Object-Oriented UX podcast, a podcast about tackling complexity head-on, gracefully organizing massive amounts of information, and designing scalable, future-proof, and of course, naturally intuitive object-oriented user experiences. An OUXer is a powerful blend of information architect, business analyst, facilitator, and UX strategist. If this sounds like you or what you aspire to, you are so in the right place. I'm Sophia Prater, UX designer, chief evangelist of object-oriented UX, and your host. Let's jump into it. So today we have Carolyn Sober-James, and she is the director of UX at Acumium in Madison, Wisconsin. Acumium does design, development, digital marketing, all the things in Madison, all the things. And the reason I have Carolyn on is because she has been working hard to help evangelize object-oriented UX, which many of the listeners know that is my personal UX hustle, and it has now become one of Carolyn's hustles. So yes. She has already spoken at that conference. She's going to be speaking at MDev, which is a game design and developers conference, on how OUX can apply to game design, which we're going to talk a lot about that. And also at EntreFest, is that how you...
I think it's EntreFest, or I think it's if it was entrepreneur, I think it's EntreFest.
Yes, it's for entrepreneurs. Yeah. So, and that is, I'm really interested to talk more about that because I've actually gotten questions about how OUX can apply to innovation. So maybe we can go down in the weeds on that. So, so that's the high level on Carolyn. So, but for those that don't know you, can you just introduce yourself a little bit if you have anything to add to that, and just go into your journey on how you got into UX?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, as far as what to add to that, not too much. That you covered the high points. I lead the UX practice at Acumium. Acumium's been in business for, I think this is our 19th year. Like you said, we do all the things. We're a kind of uniquely broad digital agency, which means I get to work on a lot of really interesting projects with a lot of different clients from different verticals, different problems they're trying to solve. So it's very good for keeping the brain stimulated. My journey to UX was kind of a unique one, I think. Like, I haven't heard of a lot of people coming to UX through my particular path. My story with UX, I think, starts with like the early 2000s. And I was working at a biotech company, a life science manufacturing company called Promega here in Madison. And I was super green. I think I was like, I don't know, 24 or something like that. And became aware of user experience and sort of pitched that I wanted to kind of fire up customer experience role function at Promega. And so to their credit, they were like, okay, sounds good, let's try it. And I think we rolled with it for it might have been like a year or maybe two, and the organization wasn't really ready for it. So there wasn't the support there to kind of, and I was still pretty green. Um, so, but my sort of love and addiction for user experience started there and just kind of kept on growing. So my time I was at Promega for 15 years, and so I had a lot of different roles, kind of ranging from business analyst to project manager to, then I moved into web development, sort of HTML, CSS, kind of very front-end presentation markup stuff. And then my boss said, "Do you want to become a server-side developer?" He said, "We'll send you to all kinds of training." And I was like, sure, that sounds great. So I was a server-side developer for, I think it was 8 years at Promega, still kind of doing the UX stuff on the side. Like all of my fellow devs, I was the person that they came to like, Carolyn, please help me with my interface kind of thing. So it
Okay.
was more UI than UX, but it was still sort of a common thread of passion. And
Can
so,
you go
yeah.
into just a little bit on what does a server-side developer do? What does
Oh,
that look
sure.
like?
So it's the back end coding. So I started off learning VB.NET, which was super verbose language, and shifted into working on C#.NET. So I wasn't doing really well. I mean, I did a little bit of presentation layer stuff, but for the most part, I was working on the, data layer, business logic layer, um, kind of code monkey stuff.
Hmm.
Not
Were
doing a
you
lot of,
designing the databases?
sometimes, yeah,
Okay.
had a role in it. Yeah. So there definitely was some stuff from the server side dev role that has kind of it's directly applicable to some of the stuff that I'm doing now, especially regarding the application of the OOUX methodology. So it got to be where my time at Promega was coming to an end, and I wanted to move on to something different. And I initially interviewed at Acumium for a dev role, and that wasn't a great fit, but Dan Costello, our founder and CEO, and the guy who's my boss now, called me back and he said, "We have this other thing that we need. We need somebody who can sort of be in a user experience role." I was like, "Sure." I've been doing this basically kind of as a side hustle with
Yeah.
my, regular hustle for like 12 years at this point, and maybe even longer than that. And so that's how I got to be sort of a full-time UXer, and started off as lead UX designer at Acumium, and it wasn't too long. I think it was within the first 6 or 8 months. Dan and I went out for lunch, and we were, having noodles. And I said, "I want to be the director of user experience. I want to build a UX practice." And he's like, "Cool, let's do that." So
Wow.
it was like a year and a half ish after I started there that I moved into the leadership role. It probably would have been a little sooner, but I threw having a baby and maternity leave in there, so
Mhm.
that kind of got put on. It delayed things a bit. So I've just been working to, kind of keep building that out and figure out, what's our service catalog, what's the space that we want to kind of play. We are like, we love OOUX. We're totally like drinking the Kool-Aid on that one, and trying to advocate it for clients and working into projects as much as we can.
So what year was that you applied at Acumium and they said, "Well, we don't have this dev role that you applied for, but we have this other thing that,
Yeah,
you've been interested for the last 15 years in." What year was
right.
that?
That was it was the tail end of 2014.
Wow. It
Yeah, I
just goes to
started.
show how time moves so fast. Like, I wonder how many more of those kind of opportunities, like being at the right place at the right time, because now so many more practices are grown. And I mean, I feel like I was definitely there. I was a few years before that, but like at the right place at the right time, where the UX role sort of got put in my lap.
Right.
And it was
Yeah.
like, it was somebody else actually that said, you might be good for this. Like, you applied
Right.
for this, but you might actually be good for this thing that, like, we don't really know what we're doing with this. So
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, I even though I literally had been doing some form of UX UI for the last 12, 13 years, I never would have gone after a UX role because the imposter syndrome is strong with this
Mhm.
one. And I wouldn't have been like, oh yeah, I can do that. Now now I probably would, because I've gotten more audacious in the last 5 years. But yeah, and what was interesting was, one of the initial, uh, the impetus, or one of the key reasons that Dan sort of wanted to bring on this role was actually to directly help the dev team, um, with economical and efficient throughput. Like the user stories that the
Mhm.
devs were working from were, at the time, not defined, and not at a sufficient level of detail from the standpoint of what is it we actually need to build from the interface side in order for them to provide accurate estimates. And
Okay.
so it kind of started off as this is sort of a twofer. It's like, if we focus on this, we can build better things for our clients anyway, but we'll also help our development process that much more efficient and effective, and be able to estimate more accurately. So
Okay. So it was a lot of
yeah,
like, we're having problems scoping our projects.
some of it, yeah, that was part of it. Yeah, that was part
Interesting.
of it.
So
Yeah,
I want to go back to just something you said about becoming more audacious, and kind of getting over that imposter syndrome.
yeah. I'm not
So
over it. I'm not
we're
at all
nobody's
over it.
ever over it. I'm not over it.
Yeah.
But how did you? What do you think happened to make you more audacious?
Well, part of it was that, when I joined Acumium, it was like it's a completely intrapreneurial environment. So if you're
Hmm.
familiar with that
Hmm.
term, and Dan really just kind of, I told him, I said, something I really appreciate about you is that you really don't tell me no. Like, you tell me I need more information, or you tell me not right now, we need to do this other thing first. But there were never any sort of hard no's. So I could bring ideas to the table,
Hmm.
and he was all ears, and was really sort of open to me trying stuff. And so I had been at this company. Promega's a great company, really progressive company. People are lifers there. In many cases, they stay there for a long, long time. And it was very comfortable. It was very secure. I could have probably been a lifer there. But as far as professional growth goes, it was not a rich, environment, at least in the role I was in. So I came to Acumium, and all of a sudden, my professional growth, like I said, in my first year at Acumium, I did more professional growth than probably in the last several years at
Wow.
my previous employer. Yeah, and the other piece of it, and I think I remember you talking about this, it might have been when you were on Jason's User Defenders podcast, about the forced functions idea,
Right. Hmm.
where it was just like, I started going into things with the attitude of, and I can't tell you like when this shift happened. I think it was probably just sort of, a combination of circumstances and environmental factors that made this easier. But I got to the point where it was just kind of like, I'm going to say yes, I can do this, and I'm going to figure it out as I go.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that has gotten to be an extremely comfortable place for me to play. And that's something that, as, I would provide as sort of advice or recommendations to anybody who's in a UX role, or is looking to get into UX role. Just be like, um, just decide to do it, and then
Right.
figure it out.
And
Yeah.
so those force functions, for anyone who didn't hear that episode, that's basically, it's 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 easier to explain it with an example, but I always say get the date for your conference talk before you figure out the slides, or apply to it. Like, don't wait to get everything perfect before you go and apply to do the thing, because it'll
Right.
never get done. And that's basically how I constructed my career as well. It
Yeah.
was my very first object-oriented UX workshop. I did a talk at Adaptive Path UX Week. And then Jesse James Garrett came back and said, "Hey, speakers, who would you recommend for next year?" And I just raised my hand. I said, me. Let
Yeah.
me do a workshop based on the talk that I gave last year. And I had no idea what that workshop was going to look like. I
Right.
just knew that I was onto something and I could figure out how to turn it into a workshop. And that was really scary. But what I'm doing today with coming out with this object-oriented UX course and certification. So I have a beta coming up, and I basically invited a bunch of people to it. And the first webinar is on February 17th, and we're going to do it. And I have a schedule built out, but do I have weeks 4, 5, and 6 fully planned out?
Yeah.
No, I do not. I
Right.
absolutely do not.
Right.
So those force functions, so that actually, I didn't think twice about doing that. So I've basically
Yeah.
trained myself to create those force functions,
Yeah.
and gotten
Well,
more.
yeah, and you do get, I think you get the first step is the hardest. Like doing it the first time, it's kind of terrifying. But as you do it, you realize that um, you have it within yourself to get it done. There's always a way to make it work, and there's way more growth that can happen at the you talk about it being the comfortable side of uncomfortable. Like, stay in a place where you aren't really comfortable, and it's just a really rich place for growth. So
And what would
yeah.
you say, as far as, so you were talking about how just the environment was so conducive? What advice would you give to leaders that are trying to create that kind of environment for growth?
I think you ask for it. I think you say, here's what I want from you. I want you to bring me ideas. I want you to bring me things you're passionate about. And I might not say yes every time. It might not be something that we can feasibly do every time, but I want you bringing it to me, and I want to hear your ideas. And it can be wacky. Like, don't save the wacky ideas. Like, let's talk about them, because even in a wacky idea, there can be a kernel of something that you can build on. Being a leader at Acumium, I had not been in like formally in any sort of leadership role beforehand. I wasn't anybody's manager. I didn't have any direct reports. What I've tried to build as a leader here is a place where it's safe for the people who are on my team and work closely with me to fail. there's
Mhm.
there's not going to be any sort of like consequences. There's not going to be, it's like, and that actually may sort of come indirectly from being in the environment at the biotech company with the life science and the research, because a huge part of research is skunk works,
Mhm.
where you're just kind of like, we don't know if this is a thing, but we're going to spend a certain amount of energy and time and resources kind of exploring it. And if it's not a thing, we'll chalk it up to, hey, we learned something, or we know what not to do again. But that kind of environment where you have room to fail. You don't always have to be successful. You don't always have to knock stuff out of the park.
I think that's great advice for leaders, because I think, and especially what you said about how you would frame the ask, to say, "Come bring me your crazy ideas." I might not say yes. And I think maybe some leaders would want to say, "Come bring me your crazy ideas," but then feel obligated to endorse those ideas. So
Yeah,
just making sure that it's this open conversation of, yeah, I want to hear your crazy ideas. I might bounce back with another idea that might be more realistic.
right.
But really encouraging people to do that, and for people to, it comes back to vulnerability, for people to be vulnerable and to say,
Yeah,
like, here's this thing that I've been thinking about for our company. Because I think a lot of times you might have an idea for a company that might be very transformational, but you have that imposter syndrome, and you might think, who am I to bring this idea forward?
yeah. And as a leader, you do. I mean, ideally, you have a decent toolbox of emotional intelligence kinds of things to draw from, where you can have those conversations with people. One of one of the best books I read, I think I read it in 2018. It was within the last year and a half. Was Radical Candor by Kim Scott. Loved that book, and I love the underlying principle of it, that in these relationships, personal and professional, it's this: you care personally about the person, and you have shown them, they feel confident in that you care about them, so that when the time comes, you can challenge them directly and unambiguously and kind of call them out on their shit. And there's a safe space, there's a safe place to fall, because you've built up this personal capital, and have, sometimes hard conversations is really important, for the health of a team, for the health of really any relationship, I think.
So would you recommend, you're the second person that's recommended that book in like the last few weeks. So would you
Oh,
recommend that book to people, even you said for any relationship, like just even
totally.
people that aren't in leadership roles, or people that are
Totally.
just for
Yep.
relationships in general?
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, it absolutely applies. It's written in the context of professional relationships, but it absolutely applies to personal relationships too. It's like,
Cool.
if you have that foundation of trust and care, the feedback that you give to people, or the times when you kind of call them out, they they understand that this isn't personal. There's a reason that Carolyn is coming to me and saying, okay, that approach you took was not the best approach, and here's why.
Mhm.
And that foundation of really knowing that, I want the people on my team to never question that I care about them as
Mhm.
people.
So what is as you're going around your day to day with your radical candor, what does a day in
Yeah.
the life look like for you?
Oh gosh. A day in the life for me is, well, it's different every day. Being in an agency model, I mean, you have probably the same thing too. It's you're kind of splitting energy between multiple projects very often. Also, so I generally will have, like, I don't know, between 2 and 4 meteor things that I'm working on at any given time, all in different stages of, the development or project process, which is good for my brain. I actually really like that. Like, I think I'm sort of wired for multi-threading. I think there are
Mhm.
people who need to be able to focus really hard on kind of one thing, and that's cool. I've I don't think I'm like that. I think I actually kind of do well when I can kind of, you know, bumblebee flip from flower to flower a little bit, and kind of sprinkle energy on different things over the course of a day.
That's actually interesting that you say that, because I feel like it's a very popular sentiment these days to talk about focusing on one thing, just because we are so fractured with social media and technology. Our attention
Hmm.
is it is getting harder and harder to focus. So I feel like there's like the pendulum is swinging in the other direction with the book The One Thing, and just people really trying to say like task batching as well is another thing that's gotten very popular in
Mm.
productivity. And I'm the same as you, Carolyn. I actually like splitting up my day into about 3 to even sometimes 4 big activities,
Hmm.
and to do that multi-threading. I always have 3 projects or more going at once, and I've actually been trying to focus more, but maybe it's just different types of people.
Yeah, I think it totally. I mean, my kind of general philosophy about a lot of things is, you do you, right? Like, if
Mm,
it works for you, don't listen to the self-help books unless they actually help you. Like, if you read a self-help book or a manager book, a management book or a leadership book, and it makes you feel like crap, it might just not be your jam. So find out what is your jam, because whether it's as a leader or as, somebody who's in the trenches doing the work, when you find your rhythm and your way of doing, the work, you're going to do better work, because
mhm.
you got flow then, right? Whatever your flow looks like. My flow might not look like your flow might not look like somebody else's flow.
And I think like if you like you're reading a self-help book or a managerial book, a business book, and you come in with the expectation that it's either going to be all or nothing, like it's either going to be 100% of this is going to be for me or 100% of it's just not going to be for me. I think the truth is always going to be somewhere in between. It's going to
Yeah.
be like I usually come in with the expectations that maybe I'll get one or two really awesome golden nuggets from any kind of self-development book that I read, and that the most
Yeah.
of it probably won't apply to me.
Right.
I like the term multi-threading instead of
Yeah.
multitask because it's different than multitasking. It's like I'm not multitasking, I'm multi-threading.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So going back to a day in your life, like what is do you have a lot of meetings? Are you doing one-on-ones? Like what kind of stuff is happening in a given day?
Um, the number of meetings kind of depends on the week and what's going on, and where things are kind of getting to critical discussion points with clients. From a one-on-one perspective, really the approach I take there with people on my team is that I'm here. I'm always here. This is your career, and I'm not going to come knocking on your door saying let's have a one-on-one. It's like, this is your hustle,
Yeah,
and you tell me, if you need me, I will drop everything and I will, we'll talk.
I like that.
Yeah.
Make them be proactive about it.
Right. Right.
So, one of the main reasons we're talking today is because you're using object-oriented UX and also
Yes.
evangelizing object-oriented UX. So, thank you so
Yes.
much for that. Um, and before we kind of go into some details on how it's playing out with your career and how it's playing out at Acumium, can you do something for me? And can you give your definition of object-oriented UX? Like, how would you explain it to, what's your elevator pitch for it? Just for people
Oh
who
my
are
gosh.
listening and like have no idea what we're talking about.
I would probably describe it as a design methodology that has its basis in breaking down a problem domain into understandable pieces, objects that match the mental models of the people that are in that problem domain. So those might be physical objects, they might be conceptual objects, but it's taking a space and kind of working to break it down into what are the recognizable, consistent, logical pieces that allow people sort of an immediate familiarity, immediately increase usability, and sort of a natural, effortless understanding.
Love it. I love hearing other people's definitions because they're often better than mine. And what would you say, like, how is that different than how UX is traditionally practiced, or how even you were practicing before you started practicing OOUX?
I think UX, very often there's a rush to UI. There's a rush to putting things down in some sort of a presentation layer, whether that's a rough sketch or a wireframe or a prototype, without really understanding the what's of the system, and the what's of that problem space. And in a way, to me, this really harkens back to work I'd done previously in a BA kind of role, gathering requirements for projects. That's all about focusing on the what's as well. It's kind of like magic wand time. This doesn't, we don't need to figure out how we're going to do this. We want to understand what needs to happen in this project, what needs to happen in this system. So I think traditionally there maybe is a bit of a rush to laying things down in an interface before truly understanding um, all the things, how they're interconnected, how they relate to each other, what people need to be able to do with them, et cetera, et cetera. So OOUX is I found it to be an extremely valuable foundation layer for projects, and it's a foundation layer for the way that we've had the experiences we've had with it. It's not only a foundation layer for design, it's really a foundation layer for kind of the overall solution. Originally, it was when you came and did the workshop and talk at Better by Design here in Madison, I think it was 2016,
Mhm.
and I didn't get signed up for the workshop. think, I can't remember if it was a timing thing or a budget thing, but I didn't get signed up for the workshop. And then I attended the conference and you did a subsequent talk. And I remember just thinking, oh crap, I messed up. I should have been in that workshop. And so I sort of became obsessed with like, I need to go to one of Sophia's workshops. And then you came to Chicago in, was that 2018? I think. It was like
Yes, all
one
the years run
day.
together.
They do run together. I think it was 2018. So you did the workshop in Chicago for a day, and there were four of us from Acumium that came, and we did your sort of intensive one day deal. And by the way, doing stickies on a high rise in Chicago is like absolutely the most banging way to do the object modeling.
That
I have
view was
not
nice. That was super
that
hot.
view. It was amazing. Yeah, and for us to be able to do our model literally on the window was pretty awesome. But we came back from that workshop. We were working with a banking client at the time, and literally the next day we had like a 2-hour session scheduled with the client to kind of do like discovery requirements gathering, just kind of conversations about. It was a website redesign, and we were talking. We're going to talk about what does this thing need to be, and we kind of made the in-process decision, why don't we apply what we learned yesterday and turn this into an object modeling workshop? And it was amazing. It was like the client got it. They, and this client was not the easiest client that we've ever worked with, but the client was sitting there. They got it. Like they were participating in the conversation. They were, they were writing things on stickies occasionally and handing it up to us to put on the board. And at the end of this 2-hour session, we had this like pretty comprehensive initial object model that just sort of mapped out all of the things in a banking context that matched how they did business. And it was extraordinarily productive. We had a dev in the room, and afterwards he was like, that was amazing. I have way more context for what it is I'm eventually going to need to be able to do with this system. So
And that's one of my questions is if you introduce your clients to the process. Sounds like you do.
yeah.
And how do you actually do that? Do you train them up on object, like the philosophy of object-oriented UX, or do you just kind of jump into the methodology? Kind of give me some details on how you set up that workshop and how you kind of got them on board.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way we set it up, I think we just kind of said, that particular client, we kind of said we had something we knew we want to try. I tend to keep you had like a one pager that just talked about the different color stickies and what they represent. It's sort of a cheat sheet, a key for the different color coding. So I bring that along to conversations with clients when we're going to be doing this kind of work. I think probably more often than not, it ends up that I'm doing the majority of sticky writing and sticking. So I'm facilitating the conversation, or others from Acumium who are in the room are assisting and facilitating the conversation, sort of asking questions and extracting this information from the client. I think we have had cases where, a client will hop up and kind of start doing some of it themselves, but I'm more than happy to kind of midwife that, because I think there's also a translation that sometimes needs to happen between what the client says and what you actually document. It's kind of just like, okay, this is what I hear you saying, but this is how I think this kind of comes out. Does that sound
Yes.
accurate? And they're
Yes.
like, yeah, that's what I mean. So I think if it was just like a free for all client slapping stickies up there, there'd be a lot more cruft that you'd need to kind of work through and just be like, not that either one is better or worse, but I think we tend to do more of a facilitated session where the client can just talk.
Yeah, I've done it both ways where I kind of give them the whole spiel. I learn them up and then set them loose to make object maps and kind of step them through. The cool thing about having them do it, especially if you have groups doing it, is that you can see where the differences are. So if you have a
Right.
larger group and you get them to make you get teams of 3 making 3 object maps, then you can start
Yeah.
seeing like, okay, you guys have identified these objects versus these objects. And it kind of highlights like places where there's not a shared understanding, where there needs
Sure.
to have a
Yep.
conversation, which is cool. But I've also done it when you just don't have as much time, when you don't have time to like bring them all up and sort through all that cruff, I think you called it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where I'm doing all the sticky noting, and I'm not like, they have no idea why I'm writing some stuff on a yellow sticky note versus a red sticky note. I'm just like, I know that that's
Right.
metadata, so I'm going to put it on a red sticky note.
Right. Yeah.
But it's just kind of like, okay, we're seeing it happen. We're saying something and we're seeing something get documented. Another thing that I found, and don't let me put words in your mouth, but one thing that I found is so helpful in getting clients involved and getting them involved early in the process before they're starting to see screen sketches or
Hmm.
wireframes or anything, is that the place that clients and subject matter experts or stakeholders, the good thing about getting them involved doing an object mapping exercise is that this is where they're most useful to you. They're not going to be
Right.
most useful judging your design. They're going to be
No.
most useful helping you with that information layer and helping you build
Yes.
that object map. So if you found that like that the wireframing part is easier, that you get to consensus faster.
It very well could be. I think what doing the object mapping definitely helps with is that you have an upstream effort, an upstream deliverable that when you translate that ultimately into some sort of UI, you can have the conversation with the client and be like, okay, remember how we talked about, we've got products and locations and events and people. Here's how this is coming out. Versus if you just kind of go right to design, then I think the feedback tends to be around, do people like the design or not? And
Mhm.
it gets to be that sort of design by committee thing, which is this work allows you to sort of validate, does this reflect the things that we talked about? Does this reflect the robustness of these objects that we discussed as a team? I mean, most of the time, the resulting UI just makes way more sense. So there's not as much. I think there's just kind of naturally not as much back and forth, not as much discussion, because it's kind of like you look at it and you're like, yep. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe there's a little tweaking that needs to happen, but it's like that's pretty much it. That I look at that and it just makes sense. So
Yep. You've already constructed strong bones, so the stuff on
right,
top, yeah, might just need a little bit of squishing around, but it's got
yeah,
the strong bones underneath. So you're going to be speaking at two upcoming conferences, and I want to talk
yes,
about each of those. So the next one you have is at the game design conference,
yeah,
MDev.
MDev.
Yeah, and we'll link to all these conferences in the show notes. Can you tell me a little bit about how you're spinning object-oriented UX for game developers and game designers?
Yeah. So this is one of my ongoing forced functions because I know literally nothing about game design and development. I have never played in the space. And honestly, I pitched the talk to them because I've gotten so much value myself and seen so much value come out of OOUX in the website and application space, that it kind of occurred to me like, well, maybe there is an application for this in game design development. So I'm really pitching this. I'm going to present this as sort of this is a crossover methodology. This is to sort of stimulate your brain. You may or may not be able to use this like wholesale to do game design. There might be elements of it that they can take and apply to game design. I do think that it's probably a bit more directly applicable to like educational games or things that have sort of deep, strong roots in the real world.
Mhm,
It might be less applicable to like a full-on fantasy game because one of the whole ideas about OUX is that you're sort of reflecting and enforcing the rules and the relationships. Like,
mhm,
you know, tables don't float off the ground. There aren't dragons that are like coming around the corner kind of thing. So
mhm,
fantasy games don't really they don't subscribe to those rules. Which is not to say that you couldn't still sort of, even in a fantasy game situation, outline all the objects and still do the work to kind of identify what are the attributes of these things, what are the relationships between them,
Mhm.
what are the things that people can do with these.
I will disagree with you on that. I think it's
Okay.
even more important for fantasy games to make sure that you understand the rules because the rules are different than the real world, but you still need rules. So if you've read any fantasy before, that's like I feel like bad fantasy is the fantasy that is just kind of like making stuff up as they go along. And then to like fulfill the plot point, there's just some sort of weird thing like, oh,
Random.
now tables can float off the ground, and you're like, but what, like that was never, it was never set up, like
Sure.
now you're just trying to, like, you got yourself into a plot, or like,
Yeah.
a plot dead end, so you created a new rule.
Yeah.
And with fantasy, it's really important when you're taking somebody into a fantasy world to make sure that like this new strange world has been well outlined, and you
Yeah.
kind of understand like, okay, the rules are different, but there are rules still.
I can buy into that. I can align with your thinking on that too. Yeah. So yeah, I think the my particular approach on the talk. This was a recommendation from one of the people who's involved with sort of the leadership of the conference. She and I are connected from just sort of a network perspective outside of this conference. But she said if you can tie it into a game, if you can like take a game and kind of deconstruct it into what would that look like in an object map. So this is my plan is that my 3-year-old, my three-nager, he loves to play video games with me. So we have an NES Classic in our rec room, and playing video games together is basically him watching me play video games. So this last year, his obsession has been Mega Man 2. And I don't know if you've ever played Mega Man 2. I had never played Mega Man 2, but I have now won Mega Man 2. So I'm going to take Mega Man
Congratulations.
2. Yeah, thanks. Well, that's what happens when every weekend after his nap, he's like, Mom, let's go play video games. And I want to play Mega Man 2. And you play for half an hour, 45 minutes. So yeah, I'm going to take Mega Man 2 and kind of deconstruct it into an object map and show people this is kind of how this works, and we'll see. It'll be interesting.
Oh
I
my
really
gosh.
have no idea what to expect. It might be sort of like it might go over like a lead balloon. It might be that I've got people coming up to me after the talk and packed 2 and 3 deep to ask me follow-up questions, which is what happened at that conference actually, which was what was so awesome about that, because that is primarily a developer conference more so than a designer conference. They're starting to edge more into designer topics, but um, the appeal of OOUX as a methodology to this largely developer-based audience for that conference was super apparent just in the reaction that I got to my talk, both immediately afterwards and then kind of following up on Twitter and LinkedIn and all that. Because
Right.
I think it was just kind of like the devs got it. They're like, I see the value. Like,
I got emails after your after your
that's right.
conference talk too. So you obviously did a really, really great job. And that's always a good sign, is after your talk, when you get swarmed. You're like, yes, okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was
People
cool.
liked it. Hey guys, it's Sophia from the future. I just got a email from Carolyn about how the talk went at MDev. So she writes that it went over great. She had a full house and standing room only. And she writes, quote, tons of people took pics of the screen. There was a decent amount of nodding. Nobody left midway through. Big round of applause at the end. And then like 7 to 8 people queued up to talk to me afterwards. So yes, that totally confirms that gamers like object-oriented UX, that this way of thinking applies to game design, which is pretty freaking cool. So congrats to Carolyn for another amazing OOUX talk under your belt. So one other thing on game design that I want to throw a thought at you. One thing that I thought about with board games. So I don't play video games, but I love playing board games. And one thing that I've seen with the directions of the board games, is they're very procedural usually. They're like, they
Sure.
might tell you like, here's the things in the box, but it doesn't tell you the properties of the things in the box.
Right.
So I've thought of, and I've like sketched this out a little bit, how you could redesign the instructions for a game to be object oriented. So it just describes to you the components. So at a high level, what are these components? What
Yep.
are the relationships between the components? Like this deck of cards affects these pieces, or
Right.
these pieces affect these tokens over here. You have to get these cards to get these tokens. So basic properties of the things, basic relationships of the things, and then what you can do to the things, and like lay that land first and then go
Yeah.
into the procedures. And I feel like it would just make directions easier to learn.
I think it absolutely could. I mean, I think it would be awesome if you could find, if you could find somebody who was in the process of creating a game that was sort of, it's like the rules of this are going to be a little complex, and just be like, all right, let's OOUX it and just kind of
Yeah.
see what we come out with. And then you can, like, usability test the instructions and just be like, read this, and would you understand, tell me about what you think you're supposed to do in this game, and what do all these pieces do together and all that.
Okay, calling out all dog alert. So if there's anyone out there that is like interested in helping with this, I would love to do some sort of blog. I don't know if I'm going to do it, but like to redesign game instructions. So anybody that
Yeah.
loves board games and also is into object-oriented UX, message
Right.
me. We'll all chat about it, and maybe we can do some cool project where we like redesign complex game instructions and usability test them and see which one people can learn easily, more
Yeah,
easily.
totally.
Okay, and then the next conference that you have going after that is a conference for entrepreneurs at
Hmm.
on Entrefest.
Think it's Entrefest. Yeah.
That would make sense. Entrefest, not entree.
Entrefest. Yeah.
I just haven't had breakfast yet, so I'm thinking about entrees. What do you like? How do you see OOUX being really beneficial for entrepreneurs, or really anybody that's trying to innovate?
So the benefit I see here is in ensuring that, especially if this is sort of a people trying to take an idea to market, or carve out a bold new space in a market, that you kind of get one shot, I think, to do things well. Like as a startup, you're probably working in with limited resources, limited budget, and if you biff things on the first try, you often you're in catch up mode. So a huge benefit I see for applying OOUX principles to startups, whether it's for websites, or whether people are creating like SaaS applications or whatever. It's like doing this work is not only beneficial from just that the problem space modeling. Make sure you're really understanding, like, what is it that we're doing, who are we serving, what are the things that they're concerned about. But that anything that you ultimately create digitally, whether that's a website or an application, or hell, if it's a board game, instructions for a board game, it's like there's like no downside to taking an OOUX approach. And I think the potential dividends are huge. So for an entrepreneurial or innovative space, I think one of the huge benefits is just clarity, and
Mhm.
like being on point with that initial offering, and getting as much traction as possible as quickly as possible, because traction is huge
Yeah,
for startups.
totally agree. I would also add that I think that when you're really intentionally exploring relationships between objects, that's where I think a lot of cool innovation can happen, where you say like, "Oh, these things, they haven't been well connected before." I mean, they're connected in the real world, but like there's nothing that's actually connecting them in the digital space where I can see the
Hmm.
relationship between these things. I think that helps a lot. And then also just like modeling a domain can help you identify a problem actually.
Yeah. Right.
Just by, you might not even know what the problem is yet, much less the solution. So doing some very high level domain modeling, like I want to innovate in healthcare, or I want to innovate in ed tech, but let me just model out this domain and see where the weak parts are, actually layer on a competitive analysis on top of that domain model and see like, okay, what's being covered and what's not being covered.
Right.
um, could be really interesting. So we're coming up on the hour here, but I have a few more questions
Yeah.
for you. Do you
Sure.
got a 10 o'clock? Can I go?
I do, but my 10 o'clock is pretty understanding. So I think we could probably go over by a couple of minutes.
I'm gonna take like 3 more minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
You can have 3 more minutes.
All right. Thank you. So I think that, let me see. Which one do I want to ask? Okay. I'm going to ask you just one more question. And that
Sure.
is, where do you see UX going in the next 10 years? Maybe even 5 years, but like, where do you see this profession that's kind of like, I would say a teenager now? What do you see it growing, or what would you like to see it growing up to be?
Oh gosh, that's like a really hard question. Um, so so I saw an interesting take on Twitter recently that kind of had some resonance for me, and it was kind of talking about the difference between UX design and product design. And I hadn't really heard about that juxtaposition, or didn't really have an immediate take on how those were different. And I went and I looked up some more information about product design, and there's actually a lot there that resonated for me with regard to a UX design role purely is like 100% focused on the user, the end user, optimizing that experience, which is super cool, right? And needed. The product design, as I read more about that, it was kind of like it's the things that you bring to UX design plus a focus on the business. And I think there is some really valuable and awesome synergy between when you do good for the user, it helps the business. And when you do good for the business, it can help the user. And so that's a space that I'm personally kind of interested in exploring a little bit more, because honestly, I have to do a lot of that stuff anyways, like just the role I'm in, the size we are, the clients we're working with. I don't have the luxury of just 100% focusing on the end users. There's always some service to the business in the mix, and so to kind of be more intentional and deliberate about that, and kind of uncover, okay, what does this process look like if we're sort of addressing both of these needs in one fell swoop, like um, I think there's some really interesting stuff there. And so I don't necessarily know if that's where UX is heading, but that was kind of the take on Twitter, was that maybe we're moving into the time where it's not going to be so much UX design, it's going to be more product design with some, if not equal, at least larger focus on servicing the business as well as the end user.
I've definitely seen that trend in the conversation. My good friend and colleague, Jay Cornelius of Nine Labs here in Atlanta, he talks about how there's of course, the question, the debate of, do designers need to develop? Do developers need to design? But he thinks the real conversation is that designers need to business.
Yeah, yeah, for
And
sure.
that we just need to have it. We just need to be able to speak that language.
Yeah,
And a lot of us are kind of hands off when it comes to that. When it gets into the spreadsheets, or when it gets into business logic, we kind of want to
right.
take a step back when we should be taking a step forward into that. And yeah, so I couldn't agree
Yeah.
more.
Yeah, I mean, optimizing business functions and making it easier for businesses to do the right thing more quickly. I don't see how that doesn't help
Mhm.
end user customers. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting potential trend that I'm personally all about kind of diving in a little bit more and
Cool.
seeing what's there. Yeah.
Carolyn, thank you so much. This is an awesome conversation. I really appreciate it. And I will link to all the things that you have going on. I'm so super excited for your 2020. And yeah, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you for creating OUX. It's definitely become one of my favorite power tools. So appreciate you doing what you do too.
Awesome. That's a great way to end it. Thank you so much for listening. I truly hope you enjoyed this episode. please visit objectorientedux.com/podcast for show notes. Our soundtrack is Fighter by Ruby Bell, courtesy of Sugaroo Records. Happy OUXing!